For a long time, the ancient Sumerian tablets have fascinated archaeologists and historians because they contain some of the oldest written records in the world. These tablets, carved in cuneiform script, were discovered in ancient cities like Eridu and Nippur. Many of them were broken, lost, mislabeled, or simply locked away in museum storage rooms, untouched and untranslated. Their writing system, cuneiform, is considered the oldest known form of writing, but it is extremely complex. A single sign could have multiple meanings depending on its context, and many of the words used in the language have no modern equivalent. Even when scholars could read the signs, the grammar of the language often made little sense. Because of this, generations of experts spent their lives trying to translate these tablets but only managed to piece together fragments, never a full and complete story. For over a century, this meant the world saw only small parts of the picture, and the larger meaning of these records stayed hidden. That changed dramatically in 2025. Researchers used advanced machine learning and artificial intelligence to analyze thousands of cuneiform inscriptions at once. These AI models were not just translating the symbols, they were predicting missing pieces, reconstructing broken endings, and comparing dialects from Akkadian, Babylonian, and Old Sumerian. With this new technology, tablets that had been silent for 4,000 years suddenly began to speak again. What they revealed shocked experts everywhere. For years, the texts had been dismissed as myths, poetic stories about gods creating humans from clay. But when AI restored the missing sections and compared them side by side, hidden details began to emerge. The tablets did not just contain myths, they contained detailed records. They described systems of labor, classifications of people, and procedures involving clay, blood, and purpose. Some of the texts presented these details like instructions or lists, while others told them in the form of narratives. Yet across all of them, the same patterns appeared over and over again. The first major surprise was the discovery of multiple origin stories. According to these texts, humanity was not created as a single unified people. Instead, humans were divided from the very beginning. The tablets used different terms for different groups, each tied to a specific role or function. They spoke of shaping forms in the likeness of the gods but immediately dividing them by their purpose. One group was described as being created with obedience as its defining trait. Artificial intelligence also flagged several recurring terms that stood out. One phrase roughly translated to function-bearing life. Another referred to those who do not multiply. A third chilling phrase was clay of lower glow. For years, scholars assumed these were symbolic or poetic expressions, but once AI reconstructed them in context, a much darker meaning appeared. Some researchers now believe these lines describe early humans engineered without the ability to reproduce. If that interpretation is correct, it would mean these beings were designed deliberately as a temporary workforce, never meant to survive long enough to pass their traits on to the next generation. As more fragments were restored, the clearer the overall message became. Humanity, according to these tablets, was not the product of a single act of creation. Instead, it was a process, a series of stages, trials, and modifications. People were shaped, adjusted, broken down, and rebuilt. Some versions were discarded entirely, erased before they could leave a lasting mark on history. The idea that our species might have been divided before it even began was once considered fringe speculation. But now, the tablets themselves pointed directly to this possibility. They included classifications, names, and descriptions, and for the first time, there was technology powerful enough to stitch the fragments into a coherent whole. AI had not invented these ideas. It had revealed them. It turned scattered myths into something closer to a blueprint, and that blueprint did more than describe how humans were created. It outlined, with unsettling clarity, what they were created to do. The traditional story of Sumerian creation myths is simple. The gods made man from clay. But the newly decoded tablets tell a story that is far more complex and disturbing. They do not describe one act of creation. They describe stages, failed experiments, and variations. Humans, according to these records, were not created as one race but as prototypes and models. Each batch was tailored for a different purpose. They were not just made to work in general. They were assigned very specific physical functions. Even the terms used to describe these early humans turned out to be different from what scholars once thought. For example, some versions used Lulu, a term loosely meaning man, while others used Saggig, which an earlier Sumerologist had translated as the black-headed people. For decades, no one paid much attention to that phrase. But AI connected it to a separate passage describing a group marked for toil, with bodies molded from dark clay and eyes that do not question. Were these symbolic classes? Or were they descriptions of real physical traits? No one can say for sure. But the fact that the tablets make such clear distinctions suggests something deeper, that even in humanity's first moments, there were categories and roles people were born into and could never escape. It does not stop there. Other tablets describe the gods evaluating each group's performance. One passage talks about the clay of restless voice, a version of man that refused orders and was cast into the rivers. Another mentions a group whose limbs were too weak to bear tools and who were sent back into the mountain to be forgotten. Reading these lines, it is hard not to think of the process as a kind of system or program, one that starts with a goal and solves it not by creating equals but by building specialized tools. Tools that looked like us. The tablets also describe a region called Iden Flatland between two rivers, considered to be a kind of factory floor. Every time a new group was made, the gods would test them, name them, and sometimes erase them. None of these patterns were obvious before AI translated the text side by side. Scholars saw only isolated fragments, but now we are seeing what those fragments really were. And what they suggest is that there was not just one origin of mankind. There were many, some erased, some modified, and some still carrying the traits written into them from the start. The genetic modifications did not end there. According to the tablets, the first humans worked and obeyed, but they did not last. They could not reproduce. Each one had to be made by hand, crafted from clay, blood, and divine command. They were not allowed to multiply. That limitation was part of the design. It kept the gods in control. But somewhere along the line, that control began to slip. The tablets do not fully explain why. Some researchers believe it was rebellion. Others think it was exhaustion, too many humans dying, too few being made fast enough. Whatever the reason, the effort was no longer sustainable. So another change was ordered. The tablets describe how Enki, the god of wisdom, decided to revise the model. This time, he would not just make humans, he would upgrade them. He added something extra in the genetic modification, something his brother later discovered. The new version would be smarter, stronger, able to survive on its own, and, most importantly, able to reproduce. A new being was created. His name was Adapa. Unlike the others, Adapa was not a mere laborer. He was described as chief among men, someone who possessed divine sight and words that moved the heavens. He could speak, reason, and lead. His mind was sharp enough to understand the god's will and follow it. But even Adapa's wisdom came with limits. He was made to know much but not all. And when the time came to test his obedience, the results were permanent. According to the story, the gods, known in these texts as the Anunnaki, summoned Adapa to the heavens. There, Anu, the sky god, offered him the food of eternal life. But before Adapa went, Enki warned him not to eat or drink anything he was given. When the moment came, Adapa obeyed Enki's warning. He turned away immortality. And just like that, the chance to free humanity was lost. One decision, one command followed, and it sealed our fate. The tablets also reveal that Enki gave Adapa knowledge but held back freedom. Whether this was a trick or a precaution, no one knows. But the result was clear: humans would now live, grow, and reproduce, but they would also die. Always. That is what made Adapa different. He was the bridge between tool and species. His creation marked the start of something even more dangerous: division. Not everyone received the same upgrade. Some lines of humans remained bound to labor, unable to think beyond their tasks. Others, modeled after Adapa, were granted more autonomy. They could learn, adapt, and even lead. That split, barely visible in myth, becomes obvious when seen through the Ari's lens because now we can read all the references together. Now we can see which groups were permitted and which were only assigned. The roots of inequality go deeper than history. They go back to the very first decisions not to give everyone the same chance. And those decisions soon sparked a war not just between humans and gods but between the gods themselves. The Sumerian texts do not hide this part. They clearly state there was a divide among the gods, a deep disagreement about whether humanity should remain bound to the task it was created for or be allowed to grow beyond it. On one side stood Enki, the same god who created Adapa, the one who gave humans reproduction, wisdom, and speech. Enki saw potential. He saw a species that could think, adapt, and evolve. In some texts, he is even called the father of humanity. His version of creation was not perfect, but it was merciful. On the other side stood Enlil. In the vast pantheon of ancient Sumerian deities, Enlil was a colossal figure embodying power and authority. He was the commander of divine order, the master of decrees, the god who demanded obedience above all else. Where Enki saw tools that could learn, Enlil saw chaos waiting to happen. He did not trust humans. He did not want them to grow, and he hated what Enki had done. The texts describe Enlil's anger as immediate and absolute. To Enlil, humans were rebellious, breaking the design, disrupting the order. In his eyes, Enki had gone too far. Because of this, the gods began to divide. Some sided with Enki, quietly encouraging the growth of human knowledge. Others sided with Enlil, determined to keep humanity restricted to its original purpose. The story does not end here. The tablets suggest this struggle between control and freedom shaped not only the destiny of humans but the fate of the gods themselves. With every fragment that AI restores, the picture becomes clearer. Humanity's history is not simple. It is not a single story of creation but a tangled web of experiments, divisions, and choices. In the ancient stories translated from the Sumerian tablets, there is a constant theme of division, control, and hidden knowledge. The AI translations show a picture of humanity that is very different from what we have been taught. These tablets speak of two powerful beings, Enlil and Enki, whose disagreements shaped not only the heavens but the earth itself. Some humans were favored and guided, while others were held back and controlled. Those who stayed loyal to Enlil called for restrictions, resets, and punishment. The result was a split not just among the gods but also among humans. Some people were taught secret knowledge in dreams, like how to read the stars, plant seeds, and develop writing, counting, and metalwork. They were given gifts that pushed their societies forward. Others were suppressed, forced back into hard labor, and kept from learning these things. Their lives and histories were kept simple, silent, and controlled. The AI translations reveal striking differences in how early groups were treated. In one area, humans were called keepers of the grain and makers of laws. In another, they were described as nameless workers whose history was erased as soon as they were born. This was not random. It was a system of controlled development and scripted inequality, driven by a divine rift that kept growing wider. At the peak of this conflict, the tablets describe a breaking point. Enlil grew furious when humans continued to grow in numbers and skill, seeing them as a project that had gone too far. He decided to erase them through a great flood. This was not about cleansing the earth or purifying humanity. Enlil wanted to destroy humanity completely. He planned to send a massive flood to wipe everything out, ending what he saw as a failed experiment and resetting the order. But Enki intervened once again. He found one man and warned him. This man, later known in stories as Ziusudra, Utnapishtim, or Noah, became the last link in the human chain. Enki could not save everyone, but he saved enough to carry the line forward and preserve the version of humanity he believed in. Because of him, the knowledge, bloodlines, and culture of humanity were not completely destroyed. But the war between these powers did not end, it only changed its form. The creation stories were strange enough, but what came after them was even more shocking. Hidden in the tablets, between hymns of creation and lists of divine lineages, were lines that did not read like myths at all. They read like records and logs, describing tools, materials, and systems that should not have existed in that time. With the help of AI, these lines are finally readable, and they raise questions that no one can fully answer. How could a civilization from 5,000 years ago describe flight? How could they know how metals react to heat? How could they speak of energy so bright it turned day into fire? One passage describes vehicles with wings of wood and metal roaring across the sky, guided not by wind but by fire from within. Another describes a liquid metal sealed inside a belly of heat, moved by pulse and thunder. For years, scholars dismissed these phrases as poetry. But when AI read them side by side, it recognized a pattern. The same parts were mentioned again and again: wings, containers, heat, propulsion, thunder. The texts never said these devices were imagined. They said they were given by the gods, not to everyone, but to those considered worthy, those loyal to divine order, those who had proven themselves useful. According to the Sumerian tablets, knowledge was not discovered, it was distributed. And once distributed, it was weaponized. The AI found a cluster of lines describing a light that burned the earth and left no flesh behind. Another passage speaks of mountains splitting with fire and cities vanishing in a single day. For mainstream scholars, these lines have always been metaphors for storms or natural disasters. But others are not so sure. Some researchers now believe the texts describe technologies we would not see again for thousands of years: metallurgy, energy projection, even atmospheric flight. And strangely, this knowledge was not evenly spread. Some human groups were given these tools, while others were deliberately denied them. What kind of civilization hands down metallurgy to one group but not even language to another? The answer seems to be a civilization that was not natural, one that was structured from the top down, with humans placed not at the center but at the bottom. Even that structure was not equal. Some were meant to lead, others to serve, and those who questioned any of it disappeared from the record. One line simply reads, "They were shown the mountain, and the mountain did not return them." No one knows what that means. But the more AI translates, the clearer the pattern becomes. Technology in the ancient world was not a miracle. It was a lever used to separate one kind of human from another. And soon, that separation would go even deeper, not just into tasks, tools, or trust, but into time itself. The Sumerians were not just builders, record keepers, or worshippers. They were watchers. That is what the tablets reveal once AI pulls all the fragments together. The Sumerians did not just look at the stars, they tracked them. For 7 centuries straight, priests in cities like Ur and Babylon recorded eclipses, planetary alignments, and even subtle shifts of distant stars, all without telescopes, all without modern math. They believed the sky was not just decoration but a message board. They were expecting something. One name appears again and again: Nibiru. According to controversial interpretations, Nibiru was a celestial body or planet that travels a massive orbit, returning every 3,600 years. Ancient scholars once treated it as a myth. But now AI has detected something new: references to cycles, long-term patterns, and warnings tied not just to Nibiru's return but to its consequences. The texts do not describe Nibiru simply as a planet. They call it the crossing, the destroyer, the one who veils the light. Every time it passes, something changes. With AI reconstructing the missing lines, a pattern is emerging. The warnings were not meant for everyone. Only certain humans were told. The texts describe those chosen by Enki as watchers, guardians, and quiet observers who lived on the margins, passing down coded stories across generations. According to these translations, the return of Nibiru was not just destruction. It was a moment when the order was wiped clean and a new one took its place. And every time it happened, humanity forgot, and the stories dissolved. But one thing remained: the split. The idea that some groups were never meant to survive these resets, that ancient creators may have designed some people for extinction and others for continuity. The Sumerian tablets do not describe humanity as a single unified creation. Instead, they present a picture of people being made in separate groups, each designed for a function, for obedience, and even for type. This division was not simply about culture or tribe. It appears to have been something far deeper, embedded in the earliest stages of human existence. The texts never use modern words like race or ethnicity. Instead, they use classifications, and these classifications are not random. They follow a pattern that repeats itself across dozens of surviving tablet fragments. These fragments come from different regions, yet they echo the same structure. In one passage, a group is called the clay of strength. Another refers to the blood of brightness. A third describes the shadow-formed ones of silent hands. For many years, scholars assumed these phrases were poetic metaphors. But when AI compared hundreds of these lines side by side, the context changed completely. The pattern was too deliberate to dismiss. Each group was given assigned traits, assigned duties, and even assigned limits. The clay of strength are described as miners and laborious. They were responsible for heavy physical work, and there is no mention of them holding leadership roles or using language. The blood of brightness appear in priestly positions. They were responsible for writing, chanting, and tracking the stars. They held roles tied to ritual and learning. The shadow-formed ones are described as keepers of animals, specifically forbidden from entering temples or handling sacred tools. The texts do not only describe duties. In some passages, these groups are linked to unusual physical traits as well. One description speaks of those from the scorched horizon, marked by sun and earth. Another describes the pale dwelling ones born of stone and wind. A third mentions red soil walkers hardened in the land without water. For centuries, these names were read as poetic flourishes or symbolic categories. But Ari's analysis shows a consistent overlap between these names, their duties, and their supposed physical features. Taken together, they no longer read as random mythology. They begin to resemble deliberate categories of people, each created for a purpose. This new understanding is possible because the tablets can now be read as a whole. In the past, scholars worked with isolated fragments. A phrase from one city-state might never be compared directly to a phrase from another. AI changed this by creating a single cross-referenced record through pattern recognition, language modeling, and side-by-side translations. The scattered fragments became part of a unified system. What once looked like scattered myths now reads more like a database of origins. And that database suggests something unsettling. Not every group was meant to develop in the same way. Some were taught language while others were not. Some were given astronomy while others were warned against looking upward. Some were allowed to have personal names. Others were identified only by the tasks they performed. The assignments were not equal, and the limits were deliberate. If this system was intentional, then its implications are difficult to ignore. The foundation of what we now think of as race may not be the result of migration, mutation, or chance. It may instead trace back to a structured system of control, one that began long before recorded history. Artificial intelligence did not invent this idea. It only uncovered the patterns that had always been there in the tablets. Those patterns suggest that humanity's divisions did not begin with borders, tribes, or wars. They began with orchestration and assignments. They began with deliberate choices made at the very start of human existence. And those choices, written into the earliest records, point to a conclusion that is difficult to escape. The hands that shaped the first of us may have never intended us to be equal. We were never supposed to see the full story. For thousands of years, the tablets sat half buried in ruins. Those who found them could not read them. Those who read them could not finish them. And those who finished them could never put the pieces together until now. But who was this information meant for? Why was it buried? And why, after thousands of years, is it resurfacing now? Some scholars say this is just a myth, that the stories were always symbolic, that the gods never existed, and that the lines about roles and races are just ancient metaphors for power. Others are not so sure. Because when you line the myths against the archaeology and compare the descriptions to the migrations, the bloodlines, and the inexplicable jumps in human development, the match is unsettling. This is not about whether Enki and Enlil were real. It is about whether someone or something structured the origin of our species with an end goal in mind. What do we become when we learn the truth? What started off as an innocent AI translation has turned out to be a mirror into our humanity. The Sumerians did not just leave behind clay and symbols. They left a record of control, a history of division, and a warning we almost missed. What do we do with this? What changes when a species learns the truth about why it was made and which version of it was meant to survive?